I'm Judge Elizabeth Earl Besky of the United States District Court for the District of Columbia. You're about to become a part of one of the most important traditions in our democracy, the right to a fair trial by an impartial jury. It is your job to ensure that the defendant in this case receives a fair trial. It is important that you discharge your duties without discrimination. There is no place in this trial for any bias regarding the race, color, religious beliefs, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender of the defendant, any witnesses, or the lawyers. Everyone, including me, has biases. You may think you do not have biases, but the truth is that we are all often unaware of the assumptions, perceptions, stereotypes, and fears that affect our behaviors and decisions without us knowing it. These assumptions or stereotypes influence us and can lead to involuntary discriminatory responses that happen even without our conscious intent. The law demands, however, that jurors exercise judgment that is based on the evidence and facts of the case to determine a fair and just result. Implicit biases have no place in the exercise of that judgment. In the minutes that follow, you will hear more about what implicit bias is, how you can spot it in yourself and others, and how you can avoid letting it influence your decision-making as jurors. Thank you for taking the time to consider this issue, and thank you for your service and your effort to ensure that everyone in this courtroom receives a fair trial.
You may think you understand bias. Most of us are familiar with the form of bias that involves a person intentionally, consciously, and unapologetically endorsing prejudiced beliefs and attitudes. This type of bias is known as explicit bias. However, a more dangerous and tricky form of bias involves unconscious prejudice, which is the type of bias known as implicit bias. A person who wholeheartedly believes that there is no place for prejudice in our society may nonetheless hold incredibly strong implicit biases. Implicit bias occurs when a person makes associations between a group of people and particular traits. Those associations then operate without self-awareness to affect one's perception of, judgment about, and behavior towards others. This is a simple concept actually, and it is backed by neuroscience. Our brains have to handle way too much information, so in order to manage it all, our brains take the liberty of looking for patterns and filtering what it sees as the most important bits of information. This is our brain's version of autopilot, or you could think of it as a mental shortcut. Our brains would have to think through way too much information all the time if we did not have these shortcuts. These shortcuts help us do basic tasks like shake hands, open a door, or even sing happy birthday. The processing of these things happens in the back of our minds, in our autopilot, even without us realizing it. When it comes to processing and acting based on information about the people we meet, these shortcuts may cause us unconsciously to act in ways that we would not if we were thinking consciously. The most common example of this type of implicit racial bias is when you imagine yourself walking down a dark street at night and you see a person approaching you. When you realize that the young man is black, do you instinctively and without thinking want to cross the street and walk on the other sidewalk? We must be hyper aware of the fact that our brains are making associations all the time. They may not be in line with what we aspire to be and believe that we are. You may think, this could not happen to me. I have no biases. Maybe you are superhuman and able to cut off your neurological shortcuts before they impact your judgment and decision making. But what does it hurt to stop yourself and double check?
There is perhaps no more important time to understand and correct your biases than when you're serving on a jury. Studies show that people associate race with guilt in every study that has been done. Even people who generally have favorable and warm feelings toward people of color have a higher implicit bias when looking at the same set of facts. Allowing implicit bias to infect you as a juror during a trial destroys the fundamental tenet of the justice system, the presumption of innocence. In this case, you must walk into the courtroom and know that the defendant is innocent. You have to internalize that presumption. If you cannot internalize that, and believe it at your core at the start of this trial, you cannot be on this jury. And if at any point during the trial or deliberations, you begin to sense that your own implicit biases are creeping into your thinking and decision-making, you must acknowledge that, face that, and correct for that. You must challenge yourself and your thoughts at all points throughout the trial, and most importantly, in the jury deliberation room. Similarly, you are responsible for your fellow jurors. If you hear your fellow jurors ignoring the facts and evidence and instead relying on attitudes and stereotypes about the defendant, witnesses, or lawyers, it is your duty to address those implicit biases in your fellow jurors. Once you start doing that, start having conversations with other jurors in the deliberation room and talk to them. You should find a way to deliberate together on the facts and evidence only. If any of your fellow jurors cannot do that, it is your responsibility to report that bias to the jury foreman and then to the judge. All of us, together, must dedicate ourselves to make certain that we do everything we can to eradicate any barriers to the fair administration of justice for any person, regardless of race, color, religious beliefs, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender.
The law demands that you return a jury verdict based solely on the evidence, your individual evaluations of that evidence, and your reason and common sense. Our system of justice is counting on you to render a decision based on the evidence, not on bias. Thank you for your service and your attention. Jurors are the gatekeepers of justice, fairness, and democracy, and there is no greater reward to this service than the knowledge that you have discharged that duty faithfully, honorably, and without bias.